In character education certification course, everyone can be seated, and those making their way in, feel free to take a seat. Come up front if you want. I know it's here in Texas, we go from warm weather to cold weather like in 30 minutes, it seems. It goes from really nice to really cold. And once again, these classes do come to you live from the Peaceful Solution Character Education headquarters out here in Abilene, Texas. And once again, we'd like to welcome everyone for joining us and thank everyone for joining us. But we'd also like to make sure everyone's up to date on the things that the Peaceful Solution is offering. And we know a lot of people had emailed us and had asked questions about, is there a way that we can hear the classes without using social media like Facebook? So you can actually go on, and these are the podcasts that are available, just a few of them. You can go on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you can go on Spotify or Spreaker, and just search the official or the Peaceful Solution. Just search the Peaceful Solution, and you can find all of the classes up to date, from the very first one all the way to the last one, and they're continually being updated. So if you don't see one that's recently given, just give it a couple days and it will be up there for you to use. So you can readily go back, and they're audio, of course, podcasts, and they're there for you to listen to, and you can have them with you on your phone. You can use them in your classroom, whatever you want to do. If there's a certain subject that you're wanting to teach as a teacher, but you're wanting it to be taught from the book and you want to take excerpts, you're more than welcome to use those podcasts and to use them in your classroom. Or if you want to use them in helping a lot of people we have overseas that are watching in Nigeria right now, and I know we have a large group of people watching in Mexico and Zambia and Liberia, Kenya. I spoke to a lot of people today as I see Mexico texting me. Yes, I see you down there. These classes are very important for all people. And all walks of life can use these classes. And it's very important, especially in what we're seeing in today's society and what we're experiencing in today's society, that we work hard, hard work. Character education, applying positive moral character to one's life is hard work. It's not something that's just going to fall out of the sky like rain and then the grass naturally grows. But it is something that once we put these teachings, this education to work in our lives, it becomes natural. It becomes something that you feel like you did it without thinking about it. But you did. You put a lot of thinking and a lot of hard work into developing this character education. And William, of course, he taught the last class, and he got into, this will be a very emotional class tonight. And I don't mean I'm going to throw things or scream or anything like that. We're going to talk a lot about emotions. I figured we'd have to get emotional. I didn't have Uncle Fester or Trigger the Horse or He-Man to join me tonight. William has all those contacts. I don't have any of those. But, they help put things in your mind. And just think about it. When you can use Trigger the Horse and it puts something in your mind. That horse was born in 1934. But yet it helps put something into your mind. Even children that have no idea who Trigger the Horse was, now they know, and it reminds them of what's being said here about a trigger is something that starts a process. And it's great that we can tie these things in, these visuals, to help us remember things. But of course, look back over to page 29. This is just part of what William covered last class. And it was starting chapter 2 with controlling your emotions to your advantage. Notice that's speaking to each and every one of us. That's individualizing. It didn't say controlling someone else's emotions to your advantage. It didn't say that. Controlling your emotions to your advantage. And remember, he started out here with saying, I can't do it exactly how he did it, but you have the power, I think is how he said it. And it's the power. And remember that chapter 1, page 11 of the acceptance unit. Remember what that power is. It's the knowledge. You have that knowledge to be able to, once you're educated in these specific topics and you have the understanding of the process of how these things work, they're not complicated once you understand. But when we don't understand, things seem extremely complicated. But once we start understanding these very basic concepts and we have techniques that can be applied to one's life, you have the power, notice, to control your thoughts and the emotions that arise from the way, notice, you perceive a situation. And sometimes I think all of us can agree that we can be in situations and we can perceive them very differently from what they really are. If you notice right now with what we see going on over in Europe, around Russia and the Ukrainian border, a lot of people you can watch different news shows, you can watch different talk shows, and people are perceiving things very differently. I'm sure Russia perceives things very differently than what Ukraine perceives them. And of course, countries from the outside perceive very different from countries on the inside. But there's a lot of emotions that are being stirred up from these things. But notice it said emotions are what we feel, and no one feels the same way every day. So this is a constant change, kind of like the weather. You know, when I went out this morning, I thought, man, today's going to be a really nice day. It's warm. I took my jacket, took it back in the house. It's like, I don't even need that. And then on my way up here, it's like 37 degrees outside. It changed very different, you know, from what it was in the morning to now. To me, it was felt drastic. But, you know, our emotions are the same way. And, of course, no one feels the same every hour or every minute. They can change very fast according to what is transpiring or taking place in our lives. You know, if you notice here in the second paragraph, William covered this also, talking about how emotions inform us, so they educate us, they let us know something about our likes and dislikes and our needs. They also help us communicate with others and allow us to enjoy life's experiences. So emotions are needed. And notice the very next sentence here, without emotions, life would be dull and boring. So, you know, these emotions actually, they help bring life into perspective. They actually help bring joy into life. They actually help us, you know, look forward to the day. And as we'll get into the emotions tonight, there are many negative emotions, but that doesn't mean that you're doing negative things. And William read an example of one we'll get into here in a minute and rehearse. Just because emotion is negative doesn't mean that you did something negative. And it doesn't mean that you're going to choose to do something negative, as he covered with the STOP acronym, to where we have to stop, think, consider our options, and then proceed. Or as I think one person said, what to do and what not to do. Well, they didn't really tell you how to come up with the answer to that. You know, you have to consider these options. You know, and as he gave an example of last class, you're not sitting there going, well, you know, I think his example was I could kill him or I could beat him to death. You know, I could do that. You don't consider negative things. You consider what are your positive options to help solve a situation. That's what moral character does. That's what a positive character does. They search out the positive options to bring a positive result to a situation. You never consider negative choices. You never consider making the wrong choice and expecting a positive result. It just won't work, and it never will. Here in the third paragraph, though, he covered that, however, as important as emotions are, if they are not controlled, they will control you. And that's really the key point to emotions. If you don't control them, they will control you. And you've heard David refer to this as a puppet on a string, and we'll cover much more of that. But notice, continuing on here, it says emotions that are uncontrolled can lead to poor choices, which in turn can lead to impulsive behavior that you might regret. And William spent some time there showing the definition of impulsive on the screen, you know, and of course people like to say, well, I made a choice and I wasn't thinking. Well, no, you are thinking. You might not have considered things very carefully, and you remember we've already covered that self-control means you take the time to make a decision, to consider what needs to be done. Sometimes we have that option where we can take a day or two to make a choice. Sometimes if you're standing in line at a restaurant and you're deciding what you want, you can't really take hours to do that. You're going to have to do it fairly quickly, or else you will have a lot of people that's going to get emotional behind you. And then, of course, here on page 30, he covered what are emotions. And notice once again, and if you didn't underline this then, underline it now, because this is extremely important. That word strong cannot be stressed enough. Emotions are strong physical and mental responses triggered by what we experience. And when it says strong, it can mentally drain people. If you've ever been depressed because of the loss of a loved one, which that's probably a very surprising thing that can occur to people, and you have to work your way through it. But when you work your way through it, you find out, as they say, there's light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, and things can keep going. You find hope and you move forward. And remember what the peaceful solution does in bringing hope. We can still keep going and benefit society. And once again, a trigger is something that starts a process. So once again, emotions are very strong, physically and mentally, and this trigger is something that starts a process. Now, emotions are triggered by what we hear, see, smell, taste, touch, and think. So that's, remember, all the way back to the character unit, where it said never underestimate the power of an influence. Why? Because they trigger emotions. And we had examples of you smell cookies that are being baked, and it draws you back to the memory of when you were cooking with your grandmother, years ago. And these things are very powerful. And one of the most powerful that I have experienced in my lifetime is music. I, at one time in my life, used to enjoy a lot of music, and then later on in my life, I got to where it didn't really fit into my life. I got really busy with other things, and I kind of got away from listening to music in general. And then, as I started to watch news programs and more shows, and even going into the stores, I hear songs that I haven't heard in years. And of course, due to the repetition of listening to them, every lyric comes back to my mind, and even the emotions that I can remember when I heard that music last, and that was mostly when I was in high school or just out of high school, it can really bring you back to those specific time periods. And that is so powerful. You have radio stations or radio programming like Sirius XM, they dedicate channels to like the 70s and the 80s and the 90s because people want to they want that emotional connection from the music they listened to when they were younger. And it kind of brings them back to, as some people say, the happy memories of life or something like that. Now, it's kind of hard to have, where you could have looked out in probably the 60s when you were young, or the 70s or the 80s. I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. So looking out back then seemed to be a lot more positive than looking out into society today. When you look out in society today, everyone's scratching their head and wondering, nuclear war has become a very common word on every news channel. And the reality of it, I remember growing up in the 80s when it was talked about, but it was never considered as serious as we see it today. And you're seeing a lot of emotions come up with these things. Well, here, continuing on, it says our brain processes millions of pieces of information per second. Now, there's many studies that go to show, there's a huge computer. It's located in Belgium, and it processes options, choices. They literally take, it's called a smart computer, and they'll take scenarios, and they'll type in the scenario, and that computer figures out the best option that you should choose. It's supposed to be a problem solver. Obviously, from looking into society, it doesn't work very well. If we're going by it, it doesn't work at all. But the human brain, it's proven scientifically to be much greater than any computer that's ever been created. Now, that only works in a positive way when we feed it positive things and we act in a positive way, because the mind can be a very negative, a very deceitful, a very harmful, a very, as some people would say, evil, as we see in society. You see that a lot on the news these days, where it can bring a lot of harm, a lot of scamming, a lot of stealing. Some of the most creative things you'll ever see in life are scams that are created in foreign countries to embezzle money. It's extremely complex how some of these things take place. And of course, when you get that email, Western Union, we're trying to send you your $14 million, but if you don't give us your account number, we're not going to be able to send it to you. So please send your account number today. I always respond back, just send me a cashier's check, you'll be fine. And usually they never respond back. But I get them all the time because I deal with a lot of people overseas. And I find them humorous, except for the fact I know that if they're doing it, there's got to be someone falling for it. Someone is losing their money. Someone is being taken advantage of. But when I see them, it draws an emotion from me, as we'll get to here in a little bit. about how these emotions, sometimes we can all see something, and almost all of us will have the same emotional response. But here, looking at the very last paragraph on page 30, it says, other feelings might not be automatic or as easily identified as fear. And of course, the example that was used was just up above it there in the paragraph before that, and it says, you think you're going to get hit and you feel afraid. I would think if a car's coming at most people, no one's going to go, oh, this should work out really well. You know, I think most people are going to get scared. I personally think I would get scared. I think if I was to see someone else with a car coming at them or a truck coming at them and they were going to get hit, fear would immediately come over me, no matter who it was, because you don't want to see a person suffer, and you think about the damage that would do. You know, it's become pretty common in New York for people to get pushed in front of subways. You know, and I hear that in the news and I see it and I can't stand to watch it where they'll literally show it. And years ago, that would have been what they called Faces of Death programming, which was huge back then. You had to rent that so you could see it. Today, it's just shown on the news, pretty common. You can go on YouTube and see it. You know, Facebook they'll blur it out, but you click and you can see it. As long as you're over 18, you know, they take your word for that and you can see it. Well, they draw emotions, and some of these emotions can be so strong in the mind, they stick with you for a lifetime. And it can be some very horrific things that we see. But when we see horrific things and we feel those emotions, we need to have the desire to make changes. And hopefully it's what that triggers in us. And you see here, going back to that last paragraph, it says, these feelings, this is the second sentence, these feelings might be triggered by memories and might require conscious thought. Well, if we want to make life better, if we want to make life more beneficial, if we want to remove all of the negativity out of our lives, starting with our lives, but our goal is society. You know, we start with our lives, our families, our communities, our cities, our states, you know, our country, and we expound. And there's other countries doing this. You know, we have many schools right now that are strictly peaceful solution character education schools. That's what they do. They educate. And they're all becoming very successful because people are losing hope in society. But here on page 31, this is where our class is going to just get extremely emotional. So, defining emotion. Now, generally speaking, emotions can be categorized as either negative or positive. Uncontrolled, very important, underline that, circle it, highlight it. It's very important that we understand that uncontrolled plays a huge role into whether we make negative choices. Uncontrolled negative emotions are hurtful and can undermine your growth, development, and your future. But notice, uncontrolled negative emotions. They can also damage your interaction. They lead to disrespect. You know, when a person gets emotional, they become aggravated or they become someone that's, you know, like when we're corrected. I remember being young and being corrected, and I remember being older and being corrected. Sometimes we just don't like being corrected because we become embarrassed. We feel we thought we understood and we tried really hard and we still did it wrong. And sometimes it could be just outright lack of caring and stuff ends up being wrong. But sometimes, most of the time, as even adults, not just children, when we're corrected and someone tries to do something positive, we can have a negative emotion to that. And when it's uncontrolled, that's when we lash out. That's when we say things that are hurtful. You know, as we read some of these emotions, keep in mind, and not to jump ahead, but I want you to look down to fear. It's on the left-hand column, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th one down. Fear. Notice it's a negative emotion. And it says it's an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. So that's a negative emotion. But remember the scenario we just read that William read last week, and I just read again about a truck coming your way, and all of a sudden you feel the emotion of fear. Well, it's a negative emotion because it can lead to something really bad, but it doesn't mean that if you control it, that you're going to have a negative outcome. When emotions are controlled, the outcome is not negative. The outcome can be positive when they're controlled. That's the main key. They must be controlled. I can tell you all of these negative emotions, From aggravation to sorrow, I think I went through all of those when I seen gas prices this morning. Every one of those, I guarantee you, I experienced. And I controlled it, but I could not believe my eyes when I seen a $5 sign up on a gas price, or diesel, in Abilene. It was like, you got to be joking me. It was like 3 something when I last went into town. But, I didn't get out. I didn't stomp anything. I didn't curse anybody. Didn't throw anything. And when it's all over with, just think, you can do those things. You can get out, scream, yell, but you still got to pay $5 for it if you want it. And I can tell you, and I'm not promoting high gas prices in any which way, shape, or form. I don't like paying them more than the next person does, but I don't want to steal it either. But I can tell you, if my choice was to pay $5 or not have any at all, $5 would seem pretty fair then. And I remember the author of The Peaceful Solution one time giving a scenario about gas prices. And back then, I think they were trying to get it up to $2 a gallon. And he said, if you get angry, if you get upset when gas prices are $2 a gallon, well, they'll take it up to $3.50 or $4. And then when they take it back down to $2.50, you'll be thankful you're paying $2.50 a gallon. And you know what? He was right. Because I remember paying a lot of money for diesel fuel just a few years ago. And, of course, when it went back down to $2.50, I was like, man, I'm saving money now. But I was upset when it was $2. But I became very thankful when it was $2.50. So our emotions kind of change with the path of society also. Things aren't what they used to be. The report on food prices that just came out yesterday, we pay 20% more for food today than we did just 1 year ago. And they're saying by next year, food prices will go up another 25%. So that means we're paying 45% more for food over that 2-year stretch, and that's not accounting for the war taking place in Europe right now. So imagine how much more that can increase. So before you get angry and start throwing things and, think about when people get uncontrolled anger, have uncontrolled anger, they get mad at the store, so they go burn it down. Or they want to protest the city, so they start trashing the city. That is uncontrolled anger. That is uncontrolled emotion. Those things bring harm. They damage. There's no way you can receive a benefit from not controlling your emotions. It just doesn't work. But we're going to read through the emotions here, and these are the negative emotions. Try to imagine yourself. It's fairly easy to go through all these in one day. Like I said, I went through all of these just seeing gas prices. All except rage. I didn't get out and do anything violent, and I definitely wasn't explosive. But, you think about this, and you can go through all these fairly quickly, and they're pretty common in our lives today. And starting out with aggravation, to intensify unpleasantly, to rouse to displeasure or anger by persistent irritation. I call that my alarm clock. Alarm clock is something it's pretty brutal. You set it, you expect it to work, and when it works, you slap it. And when you slap it, you expect it to go back off again in 8 to 10 minutes. And then you slap it again. When you think about it, and if it didn't work, think of how bad you would be, how mad you would get at that time. So sometimes, we set things to be responsible, and then in trying to be responsible, we can become very aggravated through this process. But now if you grab your phone and start slinging it and, doing other things, you find out that's uncontrolled. And the next one is anger. And anger can be a very confused emotion for a lot of people. But notice here, anger is a strong feeling of displeasure, resentment, or hostility. But anger can be managed. And we'll discuss what anger is when it's left uncontrolled. It progresses into something much worse. But anger is a normal emotion, as we'll read here, most likely get into it next class. But it has to be controlled. It just shows that we're in disagreement with something. We have a displeasure with something. And then depression. That's an extreme state of sadness that is prolonged and can lead to changes in eating and sleeping habits. And I know William spoke about this in the last class about the things we bring out about teenagers and the most common cause of death for teenagers, the 3 most common causes of death. And it's sad that suicide, it always gets between number 1 and number 2. Accidental. Once you get into those who have driver's license, accidental takes over. But when you get below the driver's license, suicide is number 1. And it's been that way in the United States for a long time. And this is because people get depressed. And I'll tell you a quick story, and I experienced this, and I learned a lot just last week going to a certain store in Lowe's. Certain store in Lowe's. I wasn't going to tell you the store, but now you know the store. But I met a gentleman, and when I was placing an order, I had someone that worked for me place the order. The man, his legal name was Superman. And I heard that, I thought, what? Superman? And I kind of laughed about it, and I thought, who in the world? And I kind of had a picture in my mind, but I kept telling myself, the Peaceful Solution says don't predetermine in your mind what a person's like. And when I went to the store, when I went in, and here was this guy, kind of larger than life, and I seen his tag, and it said Superman. And, I couldn't help but ask him, what, because I was waiting a very long time for some stuff, and he was trying to help me as you pre-order stuff, hours in advance, and then when you go there, you wait 2 hours to get it. So you have to learn to control your emotions. But I was able to talk to him for like 30 minutes, actually. And I asked him, I said, what possessed you to change your name to Superman? And he goes, well, before I tell you the story, I want to tell you something else. He goes, my wife legally changed her name to Lois Lane. I was like, that's impressive. I have to say, that's really impressive. And he goes, have you ever heard of Carrizo Springs? I said, I have. We've been there many times and taught the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. And he asked about what that was. And that was about 15 minutes of conversation. And what was so ironic, what led to him changing his name when he was in junior high at schools we've been to. Now, he would have already had left and graduated by the time we got there. But he was saying that when he was younger, and he's a larger guy, that he was bullied immensely all the time. And one day he said, I didn't know how to deal with it. And I got to where I couldn't take it anymore. I closed my eyes and I turned around and swung as hard as I could. And he goes, and just so occurred, I hit the guy right in the mouth and knocked him out. He goes, and from that day forward, they gave me the name Superman. And I was like, so that brings back to your memory that? He goes, yeah, he goes, it's a bad memory because I would never tell someone to do that. He said, but from that day forward, no one called me by my name, which is Jaime. He said, they always called me Superman. He said, so no one really knew what my name was. They literally, as I went on through life, when I graduated, he said, my diploma even says Superman. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, but what was so super about that? He said, well, I didn't really do anything super, but I'd like to have the right answer, but no one gave it to me. And I was telling him about the program, and he said, man, I would have had that. And he became really interested. We exchanged information. I gave it to him, and he could be even watching the class right now because I talked to him about it, being online. But his story is a great story. It's a sad story because there's many people go through that, not just in school, in the workplace, all over the world. People are going through being bullied. People are dying due to being bullied. And there's a lot of uncontrolled emotions because, as he said, no one told me how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with it. And this was a big guy. I wouldn't want to pick on this guy. I don't know what size he was in junior high, but I wouldn't want to pick on him today. He's not a small guy. But, the things that it led him to do, that his name goes all the way back to basically being bullied. He said, I just didn't have the answer, but that's the only thing I knew to do. He said, I would never tell someone to do that. And he said, actually, people ask him when they ask him the story about his name. And he said, Telemundo actually showed up at the courthouse when he changed his name. He said, you got to come tell your story to the schools. He goes, I can't. You want me to tell the students to punch somebody in the mouth if they're being bullied? That's what you want to hear? So he identified that he made a wrong choice, but he still said, he goes, I still don't know what the right choice was. I just wanted to stop being bullied. That's all I wanted. And I asked him, I said, how far did the depression go? He said, well, I never wanted to give up, but I hated life. I really hated life. Well, there's a lot of people that aren't as able to handle situations as much as he did. Some people just give up. A lot of people give up. We're seeing sports athletes who made millions of dollars, movie stars who've made millions of dollars, all the fame that they could have wanted, and they're committing suicide because they can't deal with this one emotion of depression. And depression can come very quickly in one's life. But when it's left uncontrolled, depression is deadly. It's just as deadly as cocaine or opioids, or drunk driving. It's deadly, and it can take a person's life. Just like the young lady from Stanford University, who was a goalkeeper at 22, was known as one of the best goalkeepers in college sports for soccer. And she took her own life just this last week. And no one says they can figure out why. She seems so, outgoing. She seems so glad. She seems so joyful. Well, obviously, deep down inside, she wasn't any of those things. And it's really sad that her life is lost. And now people try to recognize what went wrong. We need to really do that before someone, gets in that state. And a lot of people will say, well, how do you identify it? The first step is just quit treating people like trash. Start showing people they have value. Start controlling our emotions. Let's quit being jealous of other people. Let's quit wanting to make someone feel lower than us so we can feel better about ourselves. A lot of these things are uncontrolled emotions that lead to very deadly things. And when we hear about it, we feel bad. We move along. 3 weeks later, we don't even remember the name of the situation. That's where society fails. We don't learn from what we see. We quickly forget about it unless we're affected directly. And then we'll tend to hold on to it. It's kind of like when someone's family member dies of cancer, they'll join the cancer battle. But that doesn't stop cancer, and it's proving it's not stopping cancer. They should join the what causes cancer battle and try to investigate a little deeper and to see what's bringing this forward. Because I understand what it's like to lose someone you care about a lot from cancer. But just caring and saying it's bad doesn't stop cancer. The emotion's there, but it takes more than that. It takes putting forth effort in the right direction. But once again, remember depression. And always remember when you're teaching about it, speaking about it, dealing with it, it's deadly. It's extremely deadly. And no, it's not as easy said, well, you just got to look at the bright side of things. That doesn't work. And then you have disappointment. It means to fail to satisfy the hope that the peaceful solution can offer, desire, or expectation of. We can be disappointed because we've tried to do something, as we went through with the rejection of a friend in chapter 4 of the acceptance unit. And we talked about disappointment and having to accept the fact that someone doesn't want to be your friend. There's other disappointments, people later on in life, they want that job, or they want that home loan, or they want that automotive loan, they want this, they want that, and they don't get it, and they become disappointed. But sometimes in life you realize that the disappointment that you went through by not getting that job, just by having patience, something better came along. So sometimes the disappointment we go through, we realize that we really had the wrong focus to begin with. And if we're setting goals, as we talked about in the acceptance unit, and we're not thinking them out, we're not writing them down, we're not planning them, and our goals fail, well, we remember it says you set yourself up for disappointment. And that's what we have to be careful of. Some of these emotions we can actually predetermine through our choices. And that's what comes of it. If you're going to commit a crime, you shouldn't be disappointed when you go to jail. You should expect that. If you go out and willfully commit a crime and cause harm to someone, that's the way society works. And then we have embarrassment, feeling self-conscious, humiliated, or uncomfortable. I think we all can experience this, some form, fashion, or another. And of course, when you're around friends, embarrassment doesn't seem to be as bad, because friends tend to, it's like water off a duck's back. The people if you slipped, in the sanctuary or a auditorium or any kind of place you're speaking, because we teach in gymnasiums, schools, anywhere. And if you slipped and only one or two people seen you, like you jump up and you look around to make sure nobody's seen it, you're not as embarrassed if you fell in front of the whole group of people. It's kind of like the young lady that I seen on the news. I think her name was Selena Gomez. She was wearing these really high-dollar shoes, and she fell right in front of everybody. Right when they're supposed to be showing this beautiful wardrobe, expensive jewelry, high-dollar clothes. She slipped and she fell. And they replayed it on the news constantly. But I noticed when they replayed her later, she took her shoes off and she was walking barefooted everywhere because of the embarrassment she went through of falling there in front of everyone. But embarrassment can also come by not controlling our emotions. If you've ever lashed out at someone in public and then stopped to think about what you did, it's pretty embarrassing to realize how you didn't control your emotions. But once again, embarrassment when controlled, you can get through it. But if it's uncontrolled, we'll see how it can lead to anger and even rage. Then, of course, fear. We've already read fear, and we discussed that with the situation, that with the scenario that was showed. And then we have frustration. And that's dissatisfaction that comes from unresolved problems or unfulfilled needs. Now, needs and wants can be two different things. Remember that. When something we want is not fulfilled and we just want it, but we really didn't need it, that's not really something to get frustrated over. But some frustrations we see that are needs. You see society, you can always go online and see countries like Somalia, Sudan. You can look down to Latin America of people that are doing without everyday basic needs, clean water, food to eat, things that we kind of take for granted here in the United States. And we get upset because we're paying more, but you still got it. Once again, if you get to where you don't have it, you become thankful that you're paying 3 times more than what you once paid. And it's hard to see that, but think about countries that you can be in a country, they call them third world countries, that doesn't have the food supply that we have. And I can tell, I've been to countries that when you go there, imagine when you want a bag of potato chips. And there was a Walmart in this country, and myself and William and some other teachers went to this country. And this is something in America. You go to Walmart and you go to the potato chip aisle, and there's just so many different potato chips. There's different flavors, more than you could ever imagine. Well, imagine that same length of aisle, and you turn down it, and it's the same potato chip all the way down the aisle. Just thousands and thousands of bags of the same potato chip. And I had to look a couple times, and I'm thinking, this cannot be right. There is no way this can be right. And I went to the other aisle, and it was a can of certain sardines, and the whole aisle was that one can of sardines. And I'm like, boy, life here doesn't get very exciting. This is pretty much the limit of it. And, of course, you start realizing that, people in different countries, and this was a very popular city, very large city, very old city. But life was very generic there. Very generic. And we didn't get frustrated over it until after, I think, 3 days of Oreos, it became frustrating. That became really frustrating when you're stuck down somewhere and you're looking at the labels and it's like, I can't speak that language. And Google Translate didn't work because they didn't have internet. So there was some frustration, and after a while, the things you like do get old. But, of course, you still didn't protest. Of course, then you have guilt. And this is self-reproach that comes from blaming oneself for real or imaginary wrong. And it's very important that if you feel guilt, especially as a young person, but this goes for everyone, go to someone and talk to them about it. If you've done something, if you broke something, if you made a bad choice, it's not the end of the world, so to speak. But if you don't do something about it and you try to, I broke it, let me throw it in the dumpster and hopefully nobody notices it's gone. Well, that's not a fix. Even if no one ever notices that it's gone, that's not a fix. And we've had situations and scenarios when in the character unit where if you steal a bicycle, man, you have that reward of a bicycle, but you can't show anybody. You have to hide it. You can't put it out in the front yard where everybody can see it or ride it down the road with your friends. You got to hide it from your parents and everyone else because of the guilt. Because, when we steal things and we make bad choices, the guilt is always there. And it doesn't go away. And I've learned one thing with going into prisons, and I've had many people tell me this in prison. A person who goes to prison for theft, who is a thief, does not like to be stolen from. They get very mad when somebody steals their stuff in prison. But they themselves went to prison for stealing things, but they don't like to be stolen from themselves. And that just goes to show how this keeps going and going and going. But then you have hopelessness and despair. And that means having no expectations of success, remedy, or solution. We see that taking place in our world today. I dare say the person that has called me 10 times in the last 4 minutes is probably feeling hopelessness right now that I'm not going to answer their phone call. I would hope they're watching class. But of course, this hopelessness or despair, consider for yourself. If you see no hope in the next day, what is the most common thing you think it's going to lead to? It's going to take you into depression, which is deadly. But if you can find hope, if you can find a solution to a problem, that gives you the hope that tomorrow can be better. Today might not be better, but tomorrow could be. Well, think about what we see taking place in society right now. And you can look at Ukraine and Russia, but don't forget what's going on in Syria. Don't forget what's going on in Iraq and Iran. Don't forget South Sudan and Sudan. Don't forget what's taking place in Nigeria or Afghanistan or Venezuela or Colombia or Mexico. Don't forget what's taking place all around the world. That's bringing heart-aching, news-breaking things that are supposed to be, here's the latest news. Watching the news can be extremely depressing because you don't really see many positive things. And our world has become so small through technology. What takes place on the other side of the world that could take you 10, 12, 20 hours to fly to affects us today here in the United States, or what we do affects people all around the world. Just like gas prices that skyrocket, or nuclear bombs or nuclear power plants that are hit. They will affect all of us. And that's a study that was done many years ago that shows the effects of these decisions. And there can be a lot of hopelessness or despair when you're living in Ukraine right now, or in Russia, or in Syria, or in many other countries. We kind of limit it to the latest one we've seen on TV. But it's going on all over the place. And we tend to think, well, if you take it off of Syria for a little bit, things are better in Syria. Well, I can tell you, I haven't seen Palestine or Israel in the news lately, and I can promise you they didn't fix anything over there. They're still fighting every day. It's been that way for a long time. And if you just Google it, you'll find out. There's misery all around this world and a lot of hopelessness and despair. Well, how do we bring hope? Well, I guarantee you, and I promise you, and I know a lot of people have a hard time believing this, and I understand that if we would start implementing the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program into society, we could begin a healing process. No, it doesn't make money. No, you're not going to get rich. It's not going to bring you a nice house or a fancy car. But we can start alleviating pain in society. And a lot of people go, I just don't see that making that big of a difference. Well, I heard that said many years ago, and today 27 different schools in 27 different countries and hundreds and thousands of teachers who are pushing this program forward that is making a change in people's lives. No one said it was going to get fixed in a day. It didn't get broke in a night, but it will. And it can, if you're not going to have hope, then you're just going to be hopeless. And when you're hopeless and you don't seek a better solution, that's uncontrolled emotion. And then we have humiliation. That means to feel reduced to a lower position, devalued, or worthless. And that's something sometimes we do because we're upset with someone, because that we want to bring ourselves to a higher standard, by humiliating someone else. And this can be done in the job site. That's done a lot in the work area. But, it's even done in schools. It's done amongst teachers. It's done amongst, fellow co-workers. These things are always done, and they never bring forth a positive thing. Humiliation to devalue or to make someone feel worthless, once again, it spirals someone down to depression. And then jealousy, which is probably the most common emotion that, when left uncontrolled, destroys even families. And it says here, hostility toward a rival or one believed to enjoy an advantage. You know, in jealousy, if you've ever seen where someone perceives somebody has done something, they perceive it, and then they find out, they didn't really do it, but they became jealous. Or you're with your best friend and you find out you and your best friend work at the same place. He gets a promotion and you don't. You become jealous. Or, you know, here goes, I always wanted that certain type of car and they got it. Man, I wanted it, and why can't I have it? And you become jealous. You know, some people ask, well, how do I know if I'm jealous? Well, if a situation arrives and you start looking at someone in a negative way because a betterment of something in someone's life or something has transpired, and you become resentful toward a person for no reason whatsoever other than something has occurred in their life that you are envious of, you know, you're jealous of. Well, is there really a reason to be jealous? Does jealousy help build positive character? No, it doesn't. Remember, it says hostile toward a rival or one believed to enjoy an advantage. And then, of course, pessimism. And this is something that we can all find in our lives, and it means a tendency to stress the worst possible outcome. You know, and I've seen people, me myself, have felt guilty of this to where, you know, sometimes it's like, why try? It's not going to work anyway. I've done this with working on, you know, certain equipment before. I've done this with working on certain projects before, to where you realize it's going to be difficult and you almost want to give up in the middle of it. But you see it through and you find out, hey, it all worked out in the end. But being pessimist, you know, is to look out in society and go, there's no way we can fix it. Well, to not fix it means we need to accept everything that's wrong in society. And all of the negative things that occur to us because of society going in a very negative way, we accept that. And we accept that our children's lives are going to be much worse than ours. And when they suffer from, you know, whether it be a theft or, you know, you wouldn't want to ever consider, but murder or something like that. If you didn't do anything to make life better in society, you have to accept that you're going to accept that when life goes wrong, it's okay, because you didn't do anything to make it better. And these are emotions, once again, that are uncontrolled. And then, of course, we get to rage. And this is what anger reaches when it's left uncontrolled. Rage. Violent, explosive, uncontrolled anger. Very important. Uncontrolled anger. When someone lashes out and screams profanities, that's not anger, that's rage. When someone throws something at somebody because they're mad, that's not anger, that's rage. Anger in itself, when controlled, can actually be solved. Then there's no negative result from it. But when anger is uncontrolled, that's rage, and that always leads to something negative. And then we have rejection. And we talked about this a lot, of course, back in chapter 4 of the acceptance unit. And it means to feel as if you are refused, unwanted, or abandoned. And that can be very common in people's lives. And, you know, you can't look at someone and tell they feel rejected as easily as we think. This takes place in schools. This can take place amongst friends. This can take place in many different aspects of life. But if you ever feel rejected, speak up about it. Say something, because sometimes we perceive these things. They're not true, they're imaginary. As we'll get to imaginary disrespect and speak about that as we proceed into the next unit. But rejection, and then resentment. That's a prolonged feeling of displeasure at something regarded as wrong or offensive. You know, you can have resentment against many people. This is pretty common when children don't get their way with their parents and they become resentful to their parents because they didn't get what they thought they deserved. Or, I wanted to go to the fair with my friends. I wanted to go to the party. I wanted to do this. I wanted to do that. Well, and you can become resentful because someone actually saved your life. Someone actually kept you from a really bad scene. Someone actually helped you, but when left uncontrolled, we don't see the benefits of that. And then, of course, restless, feeling uneasy and unsettled. And this can become, you know, one thing we have in society that the author of The Peaceful Solution talked of many, many times is the I want it and I want it now syndrome, which leads to enormous debt. Instead of working and saving up, no, I want it now. And then we accumulate all of these things and we can't use them all, so we got to go get a storage building to put them in too. And then when the finances start crumbling, people get restless. And you see that in society right now, where inflation is here, and of course, wages are here, and inflation keeps going up. To where if you made $15 an hour last year, it's like making $10 an hour this year. But you're still getting $15 an hour. It's just your money buys much less. And that can lead to a lot of uneasy feelings. It can lead to frustration, but a lot of restlessness. And then, of course, we have being revengeful. And that's a feeling of wanting to get even or get back. And revengeful can be very deceptive. And I very carefully watch what I see in the news concerning leaders of countries. Whether it be at this time you have President Zelensky or you have President Putin. Those are the two most common. And I watch people make comments about either President Putin or President Zelensky, and they say things about them as though they know everything about them. And I really don't know much about either one of them. And I honestly don't know the facts and behind what's going on over there, the complete facts. But I got a really great idea about what's going on over there. And I think that if we would sit back and look at it, there's people that want to take revenge out on someone that probably isn't really making a bad choice. They're just trying to defend their rights of trying to uphold some morality, even though they have immorality. Remember, families are a mixture of both when we look at it. But we see people that want to take revenge on people that could possibly not be making the wrong choice. Now, war and bombing and killing is never the right choice, and it's not the right way to deal with it. But we see in society where people want to get revenge on people without even knowing really what's going on. They just want revenge. And you can see that also, you see that in gangs and cartels also. Revenge. Revenge for what? Well, there's a different reason for every day. And revenge can be deadly. And then you have sorrow, which is deep distress, sadness, or regret, especially for the loss of someone or something loved. And I think if you've ever experienced that, and once again, this example was given to me by the author of The Peaceful Solution, and he said the best way to describe things like this, he said, he always referred back to the obituaries in the newspaper, and I've referred to that many times. So where you see a name, and unless you know who that person is, it doesn't really affect you. But there's somebody somewhere is feeling really bad. Their heart's really hurting. A lot of emotions going on and sorrowful because they've lost someone. But if you don't know them, that's like you can watch what's taking place on the news with people dying every day. Here in the United States, we become numb to seeing war take place in other countries. Now, when September the 11th took place in New York City and in Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., that was trauma here in the United States, and we made a lot of changes just in how we do everyday life. But we've never had anything like we see going on in Ukraine, or like we've seen going on in the Middle East, like we see going on in Hong Kong, what Taiwan is experiencing, the pressures that are put under people because of disagreements, misunderstandings, resentment, jealousy. These things lead to global problems on a large scale. And you can be someone that's just wanting to live a basic everyday life. Hey, I just want to go to work. I just want to have a home and have a family. That's all I want. That doesn't keep the missiles and the bombs from coming in your house in these countries. And here in the United States, we're oblivious to this because we don't have that. We have to go all the way back to September the 11th or to Pearl Harbor to kind of get these ideas of this emotion that's conjured up. And, these things, we shouldn't be numb to this. We shouldn't let our emotions, we should have sorrow. When we see a life taken, I don't care if it's a Russian, a Ukrainian, a Chinese, a Taiwanese, an Israeli, a Palestinian. It doesn't matter whether it's an Iraqi or Iranian. That's irrelevant. When a life is lost because of moral character not being upheld, that's what the peaceful solution is saying we need to take a stance against. And not a stance by going and burning the city down, a stance in educating society. Because if we can take society, and if we can breed a lot of negative character into society through lack of education, and we can accomplish that, and society's done a great job. That's one thing they've succeeded in. If we can breed it in a negative way and teach it to be a negative way, we can sure turn it around to be positive. Because it works both ways. But it takes a lot of effort to turn it around. An enormous amount of effort. And it takes more effort to be positive than to be negative. You know, I know a lot of people, it takes more energy to frown than to smile. Well, you know, President Obama said that peace is more than just contracts and resolutions and agreements that are signed. It's hard work, and he was right in that. You know, and President Trump also had some things to say, and he was right in what he said about how to bring forth a better way. You know, it doesn't matter whether there's a D or an R in front of somebody's name. We're talking about positive character, and that's not recognized by political stances or by ethnicity or by citizenship to a country. Mankind is mankind, as we've discussed before in the acceptance unit, and there's very little difference, not enough to be even recognized in where we're from or who we are, the color of skin, or where we were born. That's irrelevant. We're all human life, and that's what we need to consider when these emotions are going on inside of us. Looking over here to page 32, we get to these positive emotions. And, you know, we're going to stop right here. We're going to read the very top. And then when we start back, I'm going to reread the procedure for what we've covered, because I want to give you something here. If you look over, I just want to show you this, because this is one of the very rare places in the peaceful solution where this takes place. And it's just so you're mindful that sometimes it does take place as teachers. And, of course, here in Procedure 3, you look at it, and it said, explain to students that we are all born with a capacity to experience a wide range of emotions. The first step is effectively controlling our emotions, is to become familiar with and be able to identify a variety of feelings that, notice, we all have. Have students turn to page 31 and 32 of their handbooks and read the section entitled Defining Emotions. Have students pay particular attention to the emotion of anger, rage, jealousy, and, of course, love that we'll get to, and expound upon it in the section entitled Let's Take a Closer Look, found on page 33. Emphasize that emotions, if acted upon without self-control, have the ability to negatively affect our reasoning, judgment, and interactions. Now, looking at this, look over to page 33 real quick, just so you see this. You see here on page 33, you turn over to page 34, it carries into the next page. When we get to Procedure 4, it will be the middle of the page on page 34 with not just skin deep. And that's one of the very few places where you'll have in the peaceful solution where a procedure will actually stop halfway in a page. So when we get to cover that, we'll get back into it. But I just want everyone to be aware of it, because that's a rare thing, but it does take place to where a procedure will stop halfway into a page. So we're going to stop here on page 32. We'll get into the positive side of emotions. But once again, remember, negative emotions can only lead to negative results when left uncontrolled. It's extremely important to remember that. Fear is pretty common. Anger is pretty common. To be jealous of something is pretty normal. But what do you do with the emotion? Do you control it, or do you let it get out of control? Well, next class, we're still going to be pretty emotional, but we're going to talk about the positive emotions. And, you know, we even have examples of how even positive emotions can bring bad things. And we have examples of those we'll go over and we'll discuss. So once again, thank you for joining us. Our next class is going to be the 9th. So the 9th, that'll be Wednesday at 5:30, and we look forward to joining back with you then. Thank you very much.